Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Friends, colleagues, anybody listening in for the first time, got a very interesting character on the podcast today, and great background, very skilled man indeed, and a very brave man, and we'll come to why I think he's very brave later on. But the gentleman I'm talking about is David Hook. He's the president and founder of Planehook, and we'll get a little bit of background into the company in a minute, and also of Droneport, and also how one led to the other. So, Dave, thank you very, very much for coming on board. And
Chris, thank you for having me.
And welcome to Texas.
Please, welcome to Texas.
Really pleased to have you on board. So, Dave, now you're known as an entrepreneur and an aviation educator. So, can you let the listeners and myself please have a little bit of background into how you came to create Planehook? And then we'll get on to Droneport afterwards.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So the journey began a long time ago, long before I ever thought about getting into business. I earned my private pilot's license while I was still a student in high school, and then decided that flying was pretty cool. So I went on to the Air Force Academy, and there I studied astronautical engineering. And when I had spare time, one of the things that I really enjoyed getting to do was teaching fellow cadets how to fly gliders. So that's how I became a glider instructor. And then after graduating from the Air Force Academy, I went on to pilot training and won my wings. Yeah. And then started flying C-130s. In fact, I flew a mission that's no longer flown anymore. It's called LAPES, and we used to fly about 5 feet off the ground and deploy these huge parachutes out the back of the airplane and pull tanks out of the back end of the airplane for the Army to use, wherever it was that we were dropping these. So I enjoyed flying LAPES, and then I got shanghaied back into the training command where I taught students how to fly jets. Helped the Air Force buy a jet called the T-1 Jayhawk. And then from there, I got into defense intelligence. I became a defense attaché in West Africa. And there I had a chance to fly a Beechcraft King Air throughout the continent. And then after that, I got an invitation to become an air commando with the 6th Special Operations Squadron out of Hurlburt Field. And I was able to fly C-47s and Antonov 2s and Casa 212s, and I was blessed to command an A-team of 12 of the most incredible fellow airmen, and we did bad things to bad people for a short time there during that part of my life, and then I retired. Because there was not going to be a better job that I could possibly find in the Air Force.
I was going to say that's like boys' own stuff, isn't it? Hey, bad things to bad people. I like that line. I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that more often than I would have thought. But my God, do you know what I'm saying? To meet you and shake your hand and have a discussion like this. You look such a lovely gentleman, a man I'd go and have a game of snooker with. And there you are doing bad things to bad people and flying 5 feet off the ground in a Hercules, dropping tanks. I won't go into too much detail about the special ops side of things, sure. Just in case a Hercules starts flying over Chertsey in Surrey, where I live at the moment, and 5 feet.
You'll never hear it, Chris, so don't worry about it.
I'm well hidden, Dave. Oh, seriously, that's incredible. And just to rattle off, I mean, some of the things that I was so impressed with. So you're qualified and licensed by the US FAA, airline transport pilot, certified flight instructor, single engine, multi-engine, instrument and glider, and also an advanced ground instructor and remote pilot. And we'll come to the remote pilot bit later on, yeah?
That sounds great.
You certainly keep busy.
I do, and as we were discussing earlier, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do when I grow up. So I'm enjoying the journey.
Yeah, I love that. Brilliant. So now, getting back to Planehook, okay, so they specialize in security consulting. So You want to give us a little bit of background as to what type of security consulting you provide?
Sure. So when I retired from the Air Force, it was when the Transportation Security Administration in the United States was really standing up, and their focus was on the commercial service airports, or what we would call a Part 139 airport here in the United States. But there was just sort of catch as catch can when it came to taking care of all of the other smaller airports where people learn to fly, and where business jets tend to favor, because there's not as much security concern getting to and from the jet and whatnot. They weren't necessarily receiving the same amount of care and feeding, so that became the focus of Planehook's business. And so we've been advising on the security at these small general aviation airports throughout the United States. And interestingly enough, 90% of the security consulting that we do requires almost no installation of equipment, because the very best security apparatus you can have is a human being who's interested in keeping their airplane and their airport safe, because you can reprogram them almost instantaneously, and they're waterproof, and they do tend to work both day and night.
But no, I mean, it's tongue in cheek, and you're right there. But one of the issues, and it's something that's I think accepted but not well spoken about, and especially if you do audits around airports, etc. Some of the people that actually do some of the security, they're not the best paid, and they're not the best trained. So as such, becomes a risk in itself. So the fact that people are the best security deterrent is 100%, but they have to be invested in.
I agree, and understand we're talking about two different kinds of individuals. The person who is paid to do security is probably going to be at that Part 139 commercial service airport, and the people that I'm talking about are the denizens of the smaller airports. So the person who goes to their hangar and wants to make sure that their Piper Cub or their Slingsby is still in the hangar. They are the ones who are vested in the security of their own equipment.
Yeah. No, true enough. Now, something now that we covered there about being the remote pilot, there was a natural swing towards the Droneport. Do you want to just cover how that happened, Dave?
Sure. Well, okay, so Planehook's focus is on security, and the reason we got involved in drones initially was we were looking at drones as a threat to our clients. Yeah. Because here was this untempered group of folks out flying, and what could they do to damage the economy of an airport, which is what we're all about, is protecting, because airports essentially function as business parks with a long piece of runway in the middle of them. So you want to protect the business end to them. So here was this group of folks who were out flying, and what I found was that they were well-meaning. No one took the time really to say, there are regulations that you're required to follow, and here's why we do it. And in doing this, not only can you enjoy the sport of flying or the business of flying, but you don't have to worry about the G-man sneaking around behind and getting ready to put the cuffs on you if you're doing it right. So we got involved in sort of the education and I hesitate to use the term shepherding, because that implies a certain leadership role, but we became a source of education for folks on how to fly drones right, and how to consider risk, and to be concerned for their fellow man when they put the drone in the air. So what spun out of this was Droneport, Texas, because there was a need to be able to promote and educate that went far outside of our wheelhouse of doing security. So I created a second company called Droneport, Texas, and we promote the safe and effective use of drones here in the state of Texas. And so we'll go to a drone workshop, we'll sponsor a drone workshop, we'll promote a drone race. And one of the things that I'm excited about doing now, amidst all of the COVID-19 concerns, is educating students in high school about how to use drones. And so it took this old dinosaur who was a death by PowerPoint presenter, and I've had to learn this new thing called Google Classroom. And if I could give a shout out to the Alphabet company for putting this free learning management system out there for the world to use, and it costs nothing but signing up for a free Gmail account. And that's my paid political announcement, and I'll stop there. But here's this capability that's incredible, and you can deploy it to folks who are shut in at home because they can't get out for COVID, and you can still, through the use of the technology like we're using now, Zoom, hold a virtual classroom and walk through the class using this Google Classroom. So I've had to shed sort of my dinosaur skin, and I'm a little more of a caveman now, less dinosaur, in educating young people about the responsibilities of flying drones and how to do it well.
Yeah, and it's so important. And now, obviously, nobody in this day and age can get away without talking about COVID, and it's a little bit depressing at times. And I think we've gone over the non-stop bang, 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 how terrible everything is. And there's a lot of people, God bless them, who've lost lives. So no disrespect to them, but yes. Everybody else now has got to start looking at the positive outcome. Otherwise, all the loss and everything is even worse.
Yes.
But now, this COVID issue. Now, just before COVID, drones were being considered for various medical issues in remote areas, etc. And we spoke earlier about Zipline and what they do in Ghana and Uganda and who knows, maybe in the Carolinas. But people like that were doing a lot of things. Now, as a result of COVID, how do you think COVID has sort of like emphasized or sped up the concept of drone use?
Well, I think it's rewarded the early adopters of the technology, those governmental environments that have allowed a more permissive access of drones to their national airspace. For example, in China, they've been using a DJI, what they call a GH1, which is an aerial application drone, and they've been using that to spread disinfectant over large areas inside a city. And I do have to give a shout out to a fellow C-130 flyer down under, Eric Peck, who's the CEO of Swoop Aero down in Australia. He's in the process of being able to deliver COVID-19 test kits to remote parts of Australia. And last I heard, he was in the throes of final negotiations with the Civil Aviation Authority there. So there are countries who are going to benefit from this technology because they've created a permissive environment, at least a watch and see kind of environment. They may not necessarily have entirely adopted the use of drones, and maybe are still a little wary about their use in their national airspace, but they're willing to take a chance, and I think that they will reap benefits from doing that.
Yeah, and I think now more than ever, authorities, regulators, everybody, they're looking at ways to do things quicker and with less debate and bureaucracy and administration than ever before. So I think it's a great thing to do. Now, you mentioned there that they could also be used for doing remote disinfection, maybe of equipment or whatever. But also, if they are used to drop off test kits, then for them to be used again, they have to be disinfected and cleaned as well themselves. And we spoke about the impact of the disinfection on a drone, which wouldn't normally be considered by people.
That's exactly right. So when the engineers started to put these drones together, they did so not necessarily looking at having to deal with vapor environments. In fact, if you go to a DJI Phantom or an Autel uh, drone flight manual, it will say, don't fly in clouds, don't fly in the rain, don't fly in the snow. And that's because of the parts and how they were engineered into the aircraft. Most of them have exposed copper windings, and
Yeah.
an exposed copper winding is a wonderful way of dissipating heat that naturally builds up in a flight using an electrical system. But it's absolutely terrible when you spray disinfectant on it. So if you're going to try and use this drone again for another purpose or another mission, and you're disinfecting it, you have to take care in how you do that. So it's caused a reset in terms of the drone industry, looking at how do you create a drone that can still dissipate that heat that builds up in the motors and survive a disinfection process that allows the drone to be generated for multiple missions.
Okay, which and I mean, like I said, this COVID is probably going to speed up the use of drones, but it's also now going to make people start reflecting and considering things they never thought they had to.
I agree. These well, let me use this as an example. I've got a piece of show and tell here, and this is a
Good.
Pendulum. And it's a nice little drone. It flies well, and hats off to Parrot for making it. But the reason why I'm using this one in particular, because I've got about 24 drones that I fly around with, and
I can imagine.
Thankfully my wife lets me have a very full toy box. But this drone is especially well adapted for this example. You remember the Thunderbirds television show back from the 60s?
Yeah.
Okay. And International Rescue would fly
Yeah.
and do all of these amazing missions, and they had these amazing machines that they would fly. What I see happening in the drone industry is that we're going to see the development of what I would call Thunderbird 2, which was this massive airlifter. It was the green colored airplane that had all of these cargo pods.
Yep.
And whatever the mission called for, you would upload this particular cargo pod, and off Thunderbird 2 would fly with this thing. Well, so what I foresee is we're going to start seeing more and more generic aircraft that have detachable mission capabilities. So in this case, this is a first-person view camera that broadcasts directly to a smartphone, so you can actually load your smartphone into a set of goggles and fly this under first-person view, just like a racing drone. Excuse me here. And just like Thunderbird 2, you detach that, and now you attach, instead of the television camera, you attach the remote touchless thermometer.
Yeah.
And it flies around and takes people's temperature. So what I see the industry beginning to move towards is a generic type of drone platform that has the battery voltages and power and whatnot, that plugs universally into multiple kinds of drones.
That's fantastic. So it was the Tracys, wasn't it? Was the family in the Thunderbird?
Yes, that's right.
So the Tracys were ahead of their time, and puppets, even though they were, huh?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I remember that was no, but I think that a lot of that makes sense. Now, the something else that we were talking about with the, if there's anything hanging or being carried by a drone, and we were talking about oscillations and the pendulum effect. So that's also something that's going to have to be developed, because if they are going to be distributing large amounts of vaccines or test kits or whatever, that would have an effect as well with winds and everything else, I would assume.
You're exactly right. So when you're dealing with a drone, you're dealing with a series of sensors, accelerometers that go around the multiple axes. In this case, excuse me, 6 axes of motion, so rotation and translation. And the problem is when you hang a pendulum on the bottom of something, and you see this with helicopters, when they're transporting, let's say, in Afghanistan, and they're lifting these tanks or they're lifting, whatever. Here is this huge, huge weight at the bottom of a long arm, and all it, if it's a very heavy kind of object, it's going to be less susceptible to wind gusts at altitude than, let's say, something that's very light. Well, the drones are going to be flying, at least for the near future, things that are relatively light and susceptible to gusts. So you're going to induce this oscillation. Well, what we call the PID system, that has to do with the proportional, the integrated, and the differentiated signals that help sort of take a drone input signal, and instead of making this wild oscillation dampened signal, sort of helps dampen it out very quickly in terms of a response to the drone's sensing for its balance.
Yeah.
It was not designed initially to be able to carry these platforms, and so as a result, you get this destructive resonance on the motion of the oscillation. It's made worse by the drone trying to right itself, and so it just makes it worse until the point where the drone crashes.
Yeah.
So
upside down.
You're exactly right. And so what needs to be done is having separate firmware and software packages that are injected into these drones that allow them to properly compensate for these perturbations caused by the pendular motion from their cargoes.
Oh, that's right. Do you know something? I'm just listening to you thinking. One of the things that's been going on now in COVID, everybody's been doing these quizzes. I would have you in my team any day.
Oh, you're very kind.
I would any day. Now I'm going to ask you a question. Now, if you look at what happened, and my personal opinion is everybody was too complacent, and when everybody's seen what was happening in China, there's no way it wasn't going to come anywhere else. So people just waiting. Obviously, the economies and everything else was a reason as to why they had to wait to see what they could do, etc. But so many things could have been done differently, and so many things could have been done better, which is why, looking forward on the positives, everybody should learn from it. Now, one of the learning issues is, if you remember when they were saying, everybody's got to stay in and you've got lockdowns, etc., shutdowns, whatever. Now, do you think that if we went back again, or if, God forbid, if there was a second wave, okay, those lessons and the things that could have, should have, would have been done to manage it from a more transparent, communicative perspective, drones could be better used to be showing the public where things were being done incorrectly and why. There was only a few examples where they would show people in remote areas where they were told they shouldn't be, and also, in groups, large groups, etc. But that would be ideal now, surely, wouldn't it, for the drones to be involved?
It would be ideal. And it's dangerous getting into the coulda, woulda, shoulda business. But I don't.
You have to learn from the past, otherwise.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Chris. And those who don't learn from the past are destined to relive it again.
Yep.
So I think, and sadly, I'm one of those who believes that there will be a second wave, and it has to do with just the biological makeup of the virus. That it favors a moderate and moist environment, and we get that twice a year. We get it in spring and we get it in fall. So I'm not looking forward to the fall this year.
Yeah.
Hopefully, by the time, at least in the northern hemisphere, when the fall comes around again, we will have a better understanding of how unmanned aviation can benefit the public. And I think this is where uh, uh, you know, government gets slammed a lot for its glacial pace of adaptation to change. But that's not always a bad thing, because it gives us a chance as a public to be able to talk it through and think it through. Because one of the things that I see happening is the unanticipated consequences of people's actions. You know, you thought something through, or I thought something through, only half or three quarters of the way through, and forgot that critical half to or quarter part that really changes the outcome of something. We have an opportunity through the summer months to really sit down and think through what could have been done better, and be better prepared for COVID-19 too.
Yeah.
Um, and have those assets made available. It could be that the government proposes that private industry, private operators are facilitated by local governments in doing first responder activities. You know, one of the critical resources that any government has are its law enforcement and its fire rescue resources. So you want to protect that. So if you can send a drone in for a domestic disturbance and determine that the environment is safe for the officer to go in, or send a drone in to a fire where there may be contaminants that are burning that could damage the lungs of your first responder, send the drone in.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to pay retirement to the drone.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it's also, to a degree, a deterrent, because it's like when I grew up, if someone said, "Oh, you know, there's a policeman," everybody, that was it. You knew what not to do. And now I think if they've seen, you know, a drone, they know that they've got capability to take film. They know they've got capability to take pictures, video, sound, etc. And you know, it's a deterrent as well. So it's also less confrontational, and hopefully that would also help people to be a little bit calmer in certain situations. So the actual use, I think, is phenomenal. And what we were talking about with a second potential wave, the amount of testing and the location of the testing is going to be so important.
It is, and this is where I think governments need to promote the training of those people who would be volunteers or paid employees, long-term, short-term, whatever that environment looks like, and get them prepared now. You know, here in Texas, we're seeing a spike in COVID-19 cases because, sadly, during our Memorial holiday at the end of May, people just sort of lost their minds, and they went out to the local bars and they took their masks off and they got close. And now in the last week, we've seen a spike down here of over 20% in the positive COVID-19 cases for testing. So it's terrible, it's dramatic, and the problem is you're dealing with human beings, and human beings get cabin fever, and human beings don't always necessarily make great decisions. So while you have a chance, sort of a death takes a holiday opportunity to be able to train and prepare folks for the second coming of COVID, this is the time to do it. And if I have a single message to send out to the world, is prepare now, because this isn't going away.
Yeah, and like I said, one of the things we're trying to do is focus on the positives, but that also is a positive message, because you know, for everybody who's working companies and all the people who are having problems now, they've got to start thinking about, you know, a very rapid reboot when they get the opportunity, because they need the coins coming in, but also
Yes.
how to contract in a controlled fashion thereafter and make sure things are, you know, working well. Which is, I mean, it's such a frightening situation, but a realistic one. And until, you know, the various combinations of therapeutics and a vaccine and things like that are available, you know, it's going to be something that's on the back of everybody's mind, or should be, you know,
Yes.
for the next year or so. Now, with just talking about vaccines, therapeutics, PPE, all those sort of issues that have had problems in the past. I mean, drones could be a realistic alternative for getting things where they need to be in a much quicker time and easier to do so.
I agree. The thing about drones, though, is they're not a panacea. They're not going to cure everything. Yeah. You'll still need to have the human in the loop in all of this, because technology is a wonderful servant, but it's a terrible master, and so you can never just expect the drone to start making good decisions. You need to have the policies in place that create the limits, whether it's how gusty the winds are allowed to be to put the drone in the air, how much humidity is allowed to be in the air until you compromise those copper windings in the drone, for example. Those decisions need to be made now, and public leaders should be looking at how they can reasonably adopt unmanned technology, because it's good for some things but not good for others. And even those missions where it's useful, it may take your firefighters and your police officers 6 months to a year to train to be competent to the level of doing public service with the drone. So that means you need to buy the drone. You need to get your advocate to start coming up with what the public policy is going to be, and then you need to get your operator out there training and practicing, so that when it comes time to really perform in a disaster situation, they're ready to go. But it's not going to be something that happens right out of the box.
No, I agree. Now, with all of that in mind, how do you see drone technology and the drone industry developing now over the next few years?
Well, I see that as environments become more permissible, there are going to be more lending institutions that are willing to go and take greater risks investing in the drone technologies. Chris, one of the things that I've learned teaching, I can't even really call it a teacher. I'm a flight instructor, but in a high school environment, I'm a mentor. So I guide the students in certain directions. But one of the things that has amazed me is when Dave Hook takes Dave Hook out of the information and lets the students sort of think about it and roll around in it. Their imaginations are so much further ahead of mine, because I've got almost 60 years worth of bias in the way I look at the world, and 35 years as a flight instructor. I've got, this horse has got the blinders on pretty good when it comes to aviation. But if you give it to a fresh young mind and you let them run with it, that's where the technology is going to go, and they're going to have ideas that are so much better than what old Dave Hook thinks could be done. So that would be my advice, is to go out and find that 15-year-old who may or may not be the most law-abiding citizen in the world. Give them a drone and let them see what they do with it, and then take notes, because chances are your engineers are going to be able to make that physical sense of what that kid did into a reality, and they're the ones that are ultimately here in 5 to 10 years. They're going to be your drone operators. You want to develop for them.
No, I think that's and it's very humble and very realistic of you to give that over to a 15-year-old. But it's just like baking a cake. You've got lots of different ingredients, but it still needs that little pinch or that spoonful of Dave Hook with experience, logic, and common sense. So the balance, I think, is exceptional. And I agree with you. Now, is that something that goes on? I know you do this Dragon Aviation program. Is that what you do with the younger?
Yes. The kids came up with that name, and actually I'm the newest of the mentors in this. They were already learning how to build a flyable airplane that hopefully the end of this next year they'll be taking flying lessons in. And there was also a manned aviation component to this with a fellow flight instructor who was teaching them in a simulator how to fly. And then I was invited just this last semester to come and start teaching about unmanned aviation. So my direct interaction with the students is a little bit less than my fellow mentors at the program, but the kids actually came up with Dragon Aviation because that is their school mascot, a dragon. And so we turned that into Dragon Aviation, and the kids decided to add the word Supreme at the beginning of it. So it's Supreme Dragon Aviation. And I get to be a part of this wonderful think tank of young minds who never cease to amaze me at what they see the future being. These are the folks that our futurists need to tap into.
It's good, and it's lovely. Seriously, it's lovely to see how genuine and enthusiastic and engaged you are with that opportunity that the future has got, which is the way it should be, and people should be pleased with other people's success, because that also helps everybody else. And to see somebody who's so genuinely enthusiastic about such an objective, it's refreshing, Dave. It's really nice.
Well, you're very kind. I feel like I lose 15 to 20 years when I walk through that door and I have a chance to mingle with the students.
It's a great thing, though, huh?
It is.
Yeah, and then maybe on the odd occasional evening to mingle with them as well. Then it brings back down to earth the day after, but not as young as we thought we were.
Oh my goodness, no, not at all.
So listen, just as we're coming to an end now, Dave, what sort of advice or what sort of air of caution or pearls of wisdom would you give with regards to the second wave, and also how to prepare and to manage through that storm in a better fashion?
Well, my deep background is military, and so it's always about preparing. And it's better to sweat a gallon of sweat to save a cup of blood on the battlefield. So it's better to prepare now and to invest in those technologies and in those resources that that you're going to need, that may not be there in the future, whether that's putting sausages in the freezer, or buying batteries for the drone, because we make an assumption about this wonderful logistics supply line that we've enjoyed for years and years around the world, that I call it the Amazon effect, that you can dial into your computer and 2 days later, maybe at the latest, what you asked for shows up at your door. And we don't think about vegetables and foodstuffs in a seasonal fashion, because if we want strawberries, in the middle of November,
they're growing somewhere.
Yeah, they're coming from Chile or Argentina or someplace, so we don't think about the assumptions made in terms of supply. So think about the supplies that you need, and that also goes towards your technologies. What technologies do you see that you're going to need? If it's a light, if it's batteries, whatever, it's time to get it now, because frankly, I'm a little concerned about COVID part 2, that it's probably going to be worse, and we're going to see more people in the hospitals, because frankly, the human animal hates to be cooped up, and very likely, and I will make no assumptions about you, Chris, or any of the listeners, but there are sometimes I just go, I got to get out and take a walk. And that may be the one walk where the one person who's upwind of me coughs, and they just happen to have had COVID-19 and I contracted. You know, so we used to call it the golden BB when I was in the military, and you can't ever avoid the golden BB. If it's going to get you, it's going to get you. But you can prepare for shortages. You can prepare for needs by doing your training now, by making sure that you have people who are prepared to respond. And the response may be different than what you see now because your supply line may be compromised, and you're using alternatives instead of what your primary plans were.
Which is also good to have some mitigation and some backup plans as well. So
Plan B is always a good idea.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Dave, listen, please God, it won't be as bad as anybody could think, and also more importantly, that people will prepare well. But it's been a lovely chat with you, and I've learned an awful lot. And you're a very calm, likable man, considering you're a man who did bad things to bad people at once upon a time.
You're kind to say. Well, I like to think that I did my job, and now I'm moving on.
Exactly. Listen, thank you so much for your time. I wish you well, and also a shout out for Rebecca, your wife, being a Texas Longhorn, and your two boys. So good luck. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you, Chris.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Best to you and listeners.